Hey, this is Christian Buckley with Collab Talk. And I've got a couple guests here today. I've got Anthony and Erica, and an interesting topic. I'll let you guys start off by introducing yourselves. So, Anthony.
Yeah, hey Christian. Look, hi everyone out there. It's Anthony Woodward here. I'm the Chief Technology Officer and one of the founders here at Record Point Software. I really look after our critical strategies and all of our engineering here, and I'll let Erica introduce herself, and she's part of my team.
Hey, Erica Telly, product evangelist for Record Point. I work in our marketing group. I help our craft our product messages, build our community, and do fun things like this video.
And Erica, I have to point out that this was a completely random thing. I just happened to be wearing one of her t-shirts.
Hey!
So we still have like some of the best t-shirts that we designed for the SharePoint Saturday Redmond. And of course, Erica and I worked together on those for almost 8 years. So just a long time working on those, and still have a bunch of the t-shirts.
Yeah, those are some of my favorite shirts for sure.
They were really well designed with the Seattle space. So I've been away from the Seattle area now for about 1.5 years. I'm out of Salt Lake, but you guys where are you guys all based? Is it all there in the Seattle area? Do you have people in other locations?
Yeah, so both Erica and I are based in Seattle. We've got a good set of staff here in Seattle, but we've also got offices in Sydney, where actually most of our engineering is. A smaller office with an engineering outpost in Melbourne, which is looking after a lot of our AI and machine learning pieces, and then another bunch of folks sitting in London looking after our European customers.
Oh, excellent. Well, let's dive right into it. I think the main topic I wanted to cover was around what's happening within the SharePoint space. Of course, over the last 2 years, with this resurgence in the SharePoint brand and so much innovation that's coming at such a rapid pace, one of the areas that people have had questions about, like the changes around SharePoint as a records management platform. And it's always had, for those people that are the true records management, and I know and knowledge management folks, some same complaints, that it's never quite done everything the way that we would like it to, and which is helped spur these partner solutions on top of that. But what is the evolution of the space? Where are we today with SharePoint now that we have 2019 that's coming out this year?
Yeah, look, it's been a long evolution, and Microsoft certainly made some big investments into providing great document management and flowing into records management. I think it's important to really connect those two, because when you talk about records, it isn't just a matter of talking about sort of the specific elements of high-end regulatory legislation. It's actually looking at, well, what is your life cycle process? So, what Microsoft have done is really include and implement deep lifecycle processes into SharePoint over time, and that now allows single phase retention. It allows the ability to tag and classify, and then if you move into Office 365, where you get much stronger labeling capabilities, you can apply labels. So they've really thought heavily about how that integrates and how those processes work for customers. And really where people like ourselves as an add-on fit in is to really extend that value proposition. So, I guess we liken it a lot to thinking about how people manage their Exchange servers and their email, in that, yes, you can probably archive and manage your email totally inside Exchange, and there's a lot of great capabilities Microsoft provides there. However, there are some missing gaps if you have a large corpus of email, or if you have a large set of working processes you need to deal with, archiving, restoring, e-discovery of that email. And it's the same for records. We really fit in where that high-end capabilities required, where you've got these more complex tasks to discover information, to sort that information out, and then from a records perspective, to retain and govern that information. So making it really fits into 4 categories for us: visibility, immutability, accuracy, and then auditability. And they're the things that we really add to the platform that Microsoft kind of just doesn't quite get there on.
Well, and I know that also, one of the things that Microsoft is trying to do is get away from this concept of SharePoint being the Swiss Army knife that you can build it into whatever you need to do. Instead, which honestly, I think that they've had difficulty with that message for many years, because then you have these partners that feel like, well, wait a second, we've gone out, we're experts in this category. We've built exactly this thing. And so, I don't know what, if you're still tracking that kind of thing, like how many customers that have gone and failed at trying to build it themselves or dealing with out of the box and saying, no, hey, we've got this capability. But the other thing I would add in, maybe you guys could talk about too, is how now with the introductions of other solutions within Office 365, of course, Yammer's been there a number of years, but now with Microsoft Teams, that also disrupts some of the successes that we had with SharePoint and getting people focused on, hey, we can do these capabilities. Now, in a way, they're kind of diffusing where people are working, and they don't have all the same rich features and capability that SharePoint had. How do you handle that aspect of the evolution?
Yeah, and look, it's a good point, because SharePoint's not SharePoint anymore, right? That Swiss Army knife that we all knew and loved in 2007 and its various iterations has morphed and changed. And you say things like Teams and its use of that, groups, etc. We really, from a record point stance, have always taken the position and have done for some time that, information, irrespective of what we call the system of engagement, needs to be managed. So we've taken the philosophy and worked very hard on how do we integrate with Teams? How do we integrate with Yammer? And so we've had a connector for Yammer for some time to manage that content consistently. And we do that by picking up the processes that people have applied out of the box in SharePoint. So, to come to your earlier point around customers that have done implementations, kind of got to that sort of 60% of their requirements mark and thought, oh no, I'm kind of stuck here. I need to go out and find an add-on. We really try to lift what they have there, reuse what they have, and re-implement that. And, it's very, very often for us that Microsoft will kind of make the mercy call out to us and go, hey, Record Point, I have this customer, they're using Yammer, they've started to invest in Teams, and they're partway through a records project and their auditors just come in and they are not compliant. What do we do? And so we go in and help Microsoft with those scenarios all the time in the field. And it's great. It fits, I think, nicely with where Microsoft are targeting their technology, and obviously it helps customers get through their audits or their various compliance measures they might be stuck with. But, as I said, to come back to that philosophy, this connector-based philosophy of managing information in place is something we've actually done since 2007. It's actually something recently Microsoft's discovered. So one of the big changes in records in a SharePoint world and particularly in Office 365 world is this kind of discovery of in-place management and how in-place kind of works. And once that's kind of applied to the platform, you can make it more holistic across the different platforms. So Exchange, SharePoint, and I think you'll see as time goes on more of those capabilities in places like Dynamics, places like file shares themselves even may have some of this to go back into the old worlds, or at least the Azure blob storage. So there's a lot of that tech that's changing quite quickly and then integrating into this in-place concept.
Yeah, and to add to that a little bit, I think Microsoft has realized with Office 365 that they need to have a more unified records management strategy. That's why we have Azure Information Protection, labels, retention policies. But what we kind of have seen is that those aren't necessarily implemented the same way from technology to technology. And so it can get quite confusing if you're a records manager, usually a small team or even a team of one that might have other things to do to keep track to make sure you're really in compliance. So Record Point, we've taken the approach of having a consistent management interface, consistent set of tools across all those different areas.
That's actually what I was thinking with Teams, that does not yet have, I don't think all the features are there, like around labeling. There was a lot of questions around that. And saying, you've got something out there that you're calling labeling. It doesn't work like, elsewhere. I mean, what are the plans?
Teams is even more confusing because what's actually happening is your conversations are being governed according to the features in Exchange. Your content's being governed according to the features in SharePoint and OneDrive, and your Skype for Business according to Skype for Business, which is really light right now. So if you are trying to build say you want to have a certain policy on one team, you actually have to figure out how to implement that cohesively across all those three places. There's no magic Teams compliance button.
Right.
And that, that's really what we try to do for customers and have done, not just in that world, but even in the SharePoint world, is to provide that consistency. And that's not necessarily even a pitch for us as a provider. It's more that in order to be compliant, in order to run these projects, that consistency is required. If you have an e-discovery that launches across all of the product launch information, and some of that sitting in Teams, and some of it sitting in Yammer, and some of it sitting in Exchange, legally you have to provide that. You need a way to interrogate that, understand how you're managing that, understand the life cycle of it. And that's really where we try to help customers out, is to provide that consistency, as Erica says, because it is really quite difficult.
Well, on the deployment side, and and so Erica, I know we've had many conversations about customers that go in that have they're excited about the new technology, but when they go in and really start to apply that against and determine, here's my requirements, here's my needs here, and that new technology, it's just not yet ready for prime time with these set of requirements, and there's always that kind of frustration with a Microsoft salesperson that's done a great job of getting people jazzed about the new version of that, and then have to feel like the bad guy, having to say like, well, no, what you actually need to do, and this is not yet there. So deployments can be difficult and sometimes seem like you're not moving along as fast as technology is moving to be able to meet those requirements, meet those needs. I mean, do you feel like you're having that discussion, often or less often now than you used to be?
I'd say more often, just because there's so much confusion right now around the feature set. Like they just announced 2 weeks ago, the unification of Azure Information Protection and Office 365 labels. And before that, it was, what do you use? It's so confusing. And I think, as Anthony mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, if you kind of think about the customers in two buckets, number one, kind of people that aren't highly regulated, aren't public sector government entities that have more basic requirements, out of the box stuff might be good enough for them. But if you are someone that has more complex needs, like energy and resources company, oil and gas, healthcare, so many health companies.
When you have a one-on-one relationship with the auditors?
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I'm not even, it's not going to meet your needs.
Right.
You're going to need to do something else.
But I'd also say too that records management isn't records management anymore, right? So there's two kind of issues colliding here, in that there's the technology aspects that we've talked about a bit already, and what Microsoft provides, but there's also the evolution of the domain. And the domain itself is changing fairly rapidly in terms of the regulator and the court's expectations. And it's also changing fairly rapidly in terms of the protocols and processes that are bound into these standards. So, without getting too jargon heavy into records world, because obviously this is a tech podcast and I don't want to bore everyone completely, but there are there's things like ISO 16175, which is a global standard, and that's about to go through another update, and it only was released 3 years ago. So you're seeing these kind of rapid changes in standards happen that are redefining how records are being managed, because you have to remember that the standards in this space, and even if you look at things like DoD 5015 that people reference all the time, really built out of paper management processes. They didn't really consider how to manage electronic information effectively. So you've kind of got these two parallel worlds that don't talk particularly well to each other. You've got the technology and particularly the newer technologies like SharePoint that Microsoft has, that's evolving very rapidly, but you also have the standards evolving very rapidly. And I think as those two kind of change on an organization with their various iterations, it's very difficult for either Microsoft to keep up, and in fact, Microsoft's committed to not keeping up if you look at their public statements, and the customers therefore being able to keep up with their regulator and the requirements here is something that's quite mind-blowing. And that's really the gap that we see customers are struggling with, is how to kind of bridge that and deal with that complexity as it evolves, and be able to paint some room for themselves in the future, so that once they've made these investments, they can be set and forgotten, because this is not an area that people want to keep investing into. It's not a highly productive area. We're talking just before the podcast about the copper mines there in Utah, and if I'm going to put 4 more diggers into that copper mine, that's a capital investment that has a great economic return with the current price of copper. Investing in a records management solution doesn't tend to have a great economic return. It really is an insurance process for an organization. So you really want to make that insurance buy once and set and forget. And that's really what we're about, is to minimize that spend, but get that insurance right.
Right. Well, that's the thing. I mean, anything that requires that, well, it's not a day-to-day productivity you need. SharePoint provides that capability. Yet when you're then audited or you're sued and you need to be able to go in and be able to go dig down into the data and the activities, I mean, that's when you say, well, why do we not have the access? Why can we not find this data in a way? And then you start experiencing the costs of not having that solution in place.
Yeah, we see it as probably evolving a little bit further now with the standards, and where we've made investments as well, is you also have to think about who has access to what as part of your lifecycle governance. So it's not just what information do we hold and how can I provision that to a court or a regulator, or even internally if that's appropriate. It's also who actually had access at what point in time. It comes to that authenticity and auditability point I made earlier, because those proof points are the things that are challenged in some ways more so than what you actually hold and when you got rid of it. I mean, those things need to occur, but you also need to know, am I governing this information correctly? Do I know how it's being used and consumed? What are the endpoints this hits, and where's my risk around that? So it really is that risk play to manage information effectively. And that, for a lot of businesses, plays into all sorts of things: occupational health and safety, processes around governing how banking and finances and approvals work. There's a lot of areas that organizations are starting to see that this adds a lot of value to those types of processes.
Well, and I think it is very exciting, the whole category around personal and organizational analytics. And so you have the My Analytics, you've got other data points that Microsoft is now surfacing through the admin console, certainly, but also letting individuals go and have access to that kind of data. And to your point, I mean, there's a lot of other uses for this kind of data. I mean, having been in operations roles, running employee satisfaction surveys, the ongoing stats on a weekly and monthly basis, roll up at an operations standpoint, running, ticketing or managing ticketing systems, working with tier 1, tier 2 support, having that kind of data that lets you look at, and it's not even about, an individual's performance so much as just looking and saying, where are we? Where can we do better? What is causing us to be, as an organization, less productive? Where are we getting stuck when we do have regular reviews and audits, even if they're internal? As you run through, I've had that experience running a compliance project for a very large customer a few years back, where they were going through weekly internal audits. Like, what if we then got brought in and had to do this with an external auditor, so that they were prepared to be able to turn that over. We were experimenting at a smaller scale, what could happen in a large scale. And we found that our pants were down, that we were not prepared for these small subsets. And so it just made us much more efficient in how we operated in a day-to-day, change policies, change practices, because we had access to that information.
Well, I think you're touching on something else that's really important, which is another kind of change and trend in records management right now, which is, it used to be that you did your work in a single repository that was your system of record. Now collaboration happens in so many areas, not only in all the different feature areas of Office 365, but also, Box, G Suite. If you want to do things like measure trends, prepare for audits, you have to think about those other data sources as well. I think this is something Microsoft's even realizing. Like, you can add Box as a document library instead of SharePoint in a team if you would like. Mm-hmm. So now, again, you're that records manager, you're that small team. How are you going to be applying policies, analytics, getting productivity and value from that data across all these different sources? I don't think we're ever going to achieve one repository.
No, but but that's a great point. You brought it up earlier. Is that and even like, what is a record anymore? Because you have the documentation, you have all of that activity, you have that case perspective where the way that for people that don't understand case management, and I always think like a bill of materials, and people from a manufacturing standpoint think of it like a zip file. It's important because they're all related. It's all contextual. They are one piece of one artifact, which is that zip file, but then all those different components which could have all these different pieces. But a record could be a zip file. A record could be a conversation that's text-based, that's video-based, that like all of those different aspects. And to your point originally is that we have different ways of managing all of those different things today. They're not all going into the same repository. We may not have access to all of those things. And then if you have these other outside systems, because we do not live in a world where any company that I'm aware of is like only a Microsoft technology company.
Exactly. Doesn't
exist anymore. There used to be like that, like we are a Microsoft shop and we will always do these things. And then they have these rogue IT efforts that have gone in. I don't think that those ever actually existed because employees have minds. They kind of go and do things.
Yeah.
But we do need to pay attention to where is our intellectual property, where are our records across these different systems, and recognizing that expanded definition of records, and then starting to go and take a look at, okay, how do we start to put policies in place around these? It's that governance topic again. Yeah. Which just keeps coming up. It's ongoing topic.
Yeah, and we've been working quite a bit with Gartner and others around the redefinition of that space. So what we're seeing is this concept of federated data management rather than records management, and that's a pretty broad term at the moment. It's kind of getting more and more narrowly described, but certainly where our customers are at and where we're heading as a series of technologies to really think about how do you federate your data across the different places it exists and the different applications that it's going to live within, and then how do you allow that data to be both transparent in its movement but also understood in its context. So, and those are actually quite difficult things to do because the business users today have more and more control over those applications than they ever did, because you don't need IT to provision anymore. You don't need IT to set up those processes. And so now, in order to govern that information, it's not a matter of just thinking, what do I have in my file share? It's what are my users actually using? How are they accessing it? And what are the controls around that? And that's the really interesting space for us is how does that apply to Office 365? What are the protocols that we can bring to that? And that's really where, to be frank, all of our R&D is going, is to really solving that problem and looking at how our customer base right now are leveraging tools within Office 365, so the teams and groups and new pieces that come in, even things like Planner continues to come up all the time, but extending that out into the integration there with Box and a whole bunch of other processes that exist that way.
It's and I just realized my dropped up back there. What's going on? Not sure what happened there, but that's part of the thing that is great about Teams, but also the problem that so the way that I explain it is that when you have rogue IT efforts, where you have employees that are going out and starting to use these non-sanctioned solutions that are out there. And my response is always to say to people that are in IT, like, don't just go and pull the rug out from under, say, no, you cannot go and do this, because if you have a conversation and understand what they're trying to accomplish, it's either there's an education moment, they're not aware that they can do what they're trying to do externally within the tools that have been provided, and here's how you do that. Or you don't understand, UIT, what they're trying to do, what their needs are, and there may be a valid reason for using that other system. And so what Teams does is it helps bring a lot of those rogue IT efforts out of the dark, puts it in one place so it's in context. However, the gap then is what you just mentioned, is then once you see it, okay, I understand they're using these 3 web services as well as the things that we provide. You can then have that conversation of, how do we protect this? How do we manage this? How do we, whereas before you had no idea what they were doing, you were in the dark. Now it's out of the dark, still doesn't solve the problem. And, that it is a big issue. It's why you need to have conversations with your employees so that you can start to discuss, all right, I understand we don't have this need. How can we do this in a managed way? And why this is an issue, again, when you get audited and find out the employee who moved it over to this third-party service used their personal credit card, they've now left the company, we don't have access to any of the data. Yeah. We're plugged into it, yet, it's gone. It's your intellectual property is sitting out on some service that you no longer have access to.
Yep.
And so it seems is wonderful, but also scary.
It is. And then I think the other part of that too is that now with the ability to third parties to collaborate in those environments, that you also bring into those environments as well, understanding what they're doing and your responsibilities for how they handle your information and how they work with your employees is also more complex. We're working with some large public sector customers in the UK who are getting great benefit with working with external parties using that tooling, but opens up a real minefield of not just what's the policy for my employees, but how do I know people are doing the things they're supposed to be doing when I don't even have an employment agreement with them anymore? So that adds a whole other layer of complexity that you have a responsibility to understand as an organization, and you need to know what's happening, not just with your information, but also how that interaction's occurring. And again, that's a space that we see a lot of customers kind of struggling with, and we work a lot on.
And this actually kind of touches on, if I could wish one thing for our industry, it would be stop defining a record as something that happens after you're done collaborating. We should be considering information as a, quote, record from the second that it's created and added to one of these sources, so that we don't have the risk of it being deleted too early, being taken off somewhere and that person leaves the company. There's no reason it can't be managed as a record with a retention policy and still be available for editing. There's nothing saying you can't do that.
No, and I think that's, I was alluding earlier to the standards changing. That is a lot of what we're seeing in the standards change, where a record is, at the end of the day, from the legal definition, something that represents a business transaction. That business transaction can be at any stage of flight, right? So, and at any stage of flight, you can have a litigation or you can have a process where a regulator wants to investigate that. So it's, information isn't static. And unfortunately that the record standards have taken always come from that paper world, that it was static because it was written down and on a piece of paper. That's not how the electronic world works. Things are in flight and they are documentary proof of that business transaction in flight. And so it is a slightly different way of thinking that has to be applied to that. And I think, the point Erica makes is a really good one as a result.
Well, it's anything else that you see that's coming up from, whether it's been announced by Microsoft, the things that they're working on, or things that are having your team. You talk about the investments you're making in R&D. That people should be paying attention to.
Yeah, the obvious ones are out there. Machine learning, both with the investments Microsoft's made there in Office 365 for automated classification. There's some really great stuff that came out of that they're adding to the platform in that space. Clearly you need some machine learning for the monitor back there.
Yeah, I think so. It's just it has a mind of its own, and I'm not sure what's going on. Is it on? We don't know. All right.
So that space is heating up, and certainly what we're seeing again is it's going to take some of the pain away for the problems we've been talking about. If you can understand not just the information, because a lot of the machine learning's been focused on how do I classify a document, or how does it understand the pattern of that document's use, but also the people aspect to machine learning. So, who is Christian? What does he mean to our organization? Is he in our organization or outside of our organization? And the machine learning can make different decisions around those things as a result. That's a really interesting space that we see is going to speed up the delivery of solutions like ours and how we can process information, but also therefore improve the productivity aspects. And this is where we think there's a real value add to managing that information inside an enterprise. So ML is a really big theme. The other
that's
theme,
always been kind of the promise of the technology, that it and part of the issue is that when you rely entirely on people to go in and manually make the updates and classify the content and tag it properly and all those things, they don't.
Well, and they're not records managers,
right? And so it's poorly, and when that impacts the searchability, findability of content, no matter what you have a formal legal process happening, or someone's just trying to go in and find the right content inside the environment, it impacts all of that. And so if the system is getting smarter and being able to intelligently go and automate a lot of that process and reduce the amount that you have to have for someone to go in there and manually apply those labels and those tags, then you're going to benefit from that. Of course, it's what I keep referring to it as the promises of that. And I think there's a lot of organizations that have oversold what can be actually done today. I mean, you certainly get that with all the chat bots and the automation, where there's the amount of usefulness is very small for a lot of those solutions. But it's directionally correct. We're going that direction. It is a huge part of that future. But it's in this type of solution, as record point of records management, I can see where there's a lot of that utility which you can deliver very quickly using this technology.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good summary, and you're right though. It isn't this tech isn't a solve all kind of process. That it has to be combined with other processes in reality to be successful. But and that's certainly what we're seeing. The other trend, I guess, that we're seeing is really organizations starting to think about the problem that we talked about earlier of this kind of application spread. We call it more so than information spread. And then how do you understand what you have? So it's not a true records management problem in that sort of domain in terms of retention and disposal and all the basic things. It's more a problem of governance and then providing the tooling there. So what again, we see as a really big theme from our customers consistently is they want to use some Google. They have Google. How do I bring that in? How do I make that part of that experience for Office 365 if that's appropriate? Or how do I know it's separate and just deal with it? And there are some really good business drivers for them taking that approach, and that's a huge theme we see. And probably the third theme, and I'll hand over to Eric because there may be some others to add, is really then being able to statistically report on how those different silos are operating, because there's a lot of visibility organizations are looking for to understand, what is the usage pattern? Are we actually getting value from these tools? Because some of them aren't cheap. And how are we then making sure that, we're not paying twice and those sorts of issues as well. So there are some cost saving elements to understanding this governance.
I mean, I think you summed it up really well, Anthony. I mean, basically, unite all your content sources with one management platform, and then, hey, you already have access to it. You can see what's going on, figure out how to get more value from it using analytics and other tools.
Yep, and Microsoft is making that easier by the more and more that they're adding all of these different products and services into the substrate around Microsoft Graph, which will be becoming that universal API. So, vendors like yourselves will be able to pull more and more data out of that. It helps simplify some of that complexity that's out there. I think that's really kind of the vision. That's the one that I preach, at least, of the future, where things are going. When everything is unified through the group's construct and is surfaced via the graph, then it solves a lot of these problems. We're still a ways away from that vision of the future, And whether we'll see it in this next version of SharePoint and Office 365 with the 2019 server release in this next cycle, it could happen that fast. Because I know Microsoft is aggressively pursuing that concept that of everything available via the graph, all of the conversations, the announcements that just came out around intelligent communications and what's happening with, like, if you've not been paying attention, the ability finally to be able to record a meeting that's happening within Teams. Not only that, but also doing the translation services and transcription.
I'm so excited.
I know it's. I've been saying for like 3 years now, like we're on the verge of having the Star Trek Universal Communicator. We really are. There, you could actually do that today using the Skype translation services, where you could broadcast, be watching a video, somebody remotely, and it's translating in real time in whatever language. My daughter is fluent in Tagalog, and I said, how good is this Filipino? How good is it? And she's like, wow, it's actually pretty accurate. And she speaks like a native. So they're getting really good at that, and that's coming very soon. I don't think they put dates on that. It's this year with Teams, but to be able to do all of that, capture that, and automatically, because it's part of the group, part of the team, to store it in the right place where then it's accessible and you have access to that as part of your greater record. Very exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right. The things like the graph are really interesting, and the Microsoft investments there are fantastic. And I guess our vision, if I was to sum up a little bit of the podcast today, is to become a graph of the graph. So be able to know the history of an organization and represent the history in a graph across that. I mean, there's an interesting data point that I'll give back to Gartner from a call I had with them last night, where, having said all that and the amazingness of the graph and the machine learning, there's only 20% of an organization's critical data, and particularly in the mid-market kind of organizations from 1,000 users up to 25,000 users, only 20% of their critical data is inside systems that can be moved to the cloud, let alone in the cloud. Mm-hmm. So I think we all have a big process to help customers with that challenge of getting all that critical data fed into the graph to make the graph usable. And that's, again, I think something really interesting for people to think about. How do I make sure the data's in the graph? How do I make sure it's there for machine learning so that it can be accessed and managed through those systems? But it's super exciting.
Yeah, there's a lot happening in that space. And I know that I just came back from a week in Redmond for the MVP Summit. And it's interesting, just observation around that too. Like, that was my 8th MVP Summit, and how it used to be that the SharePoint people all together the entire week and in a couple different rooms, but all the SharePoint people. Now there were people that I didn't see until the final party, like the last night. That had been there the entire week, but because it's very diffused, and people in Power BI sessions that were in another building. It was over in the Microsoft Conference Center, where we were over in Building 92, and other sessions that were happening upstairs and downstairs or in nearby locations. And I just kind of think, so it's, MVPs could then go in and pick the different topics that we're passionate about and split our time. And I think that is just an indication of where things are going, and that there's so much that's happening. I've always said that there's no one person that can know everything about SharePoint, because it was just too big. And that's even more true now, that there's so much that's happening within this space. SharePoint is still at the core of that, but it's just one piece of the bigger story. And there's just so much to consume that it's difficult to keep up, even for those that are dedicated to trying to keep up with that and be part of that conversation. But it's very, very interested in seeing how you guys expand with some of your R&D efforts. How can people find out more about the Record Point and your offerings? How do people find you? And so both you guys individually, as well as the company, find out more about what you're doing.
Yeah, of course, our website, recordpoint.com, our Twitter @recordpoint. And then also on LinkedIn, we have a very active company page on there. The other thing I'll mention is we do have an educational blog series. So if you want to sign up for our newsletter, every Thursday we send out a summary of all the blogs that week. And we do try to keep them more really about the stuff we were talking about today, rather than product pitches.
Excellent. Anthony, how can people follow you?
Yeah, so I'm on the Twitter at Woodward. So WWDWA if you want to grab me there. Via the website, and if anyone wants to Snapchat me, they're welcome to use that Woodward as well.
I just have to say, after Kylie just kind of walked away from it, I just, how could I use that platform anymore? So.
I will warn you that all of my Snapchats go into our system, so anything you send me is recorded.
Of course, because it's a record. I know it's being managed.
Uh-oh.
So keep it professional, people. Yeah. But Erica and Anthony, thanks a lot for your time today, and thanks for joining this digital sack lunch conversation. And again, just for those that like the series, you can find my blog at buckleyplanet.com. You can follow me on Twitter at buckleyplanet as well. And always happy to hear your questions, and certainly reach out to Anthony and Erica directly, or drop me a line if you've got some questions or comments. We'd love to hear from you. So thanks a lot.